beautiful day, and so good to see all of you here. And welcome to those of you who haven't been here in a very long time. It's wonderful to see you as well. Well, last week, the topic of the sermon was forgiveness, which really is the topic of our lives, right? Forgiveness and the heart of our faith. Last week, in regards to forgiveness, this was the parable of the unforgiving servant in Matthew 18. The parable of the servant who had owed a great debt to the king. The king forgave him, but then he turned around and for a very little debt would not forgive his own brother. And last week I talked about how striving to forgive is an investment in the future of that relationship. And I also talked about the opposite of forgiving, which would be building a resentment, and how that is a commitment to living in the past. It is so important to look to Jesus when we are striving to forgive, to keep our eyes on him as we step out in faith into those often uncharted waters of forgiveness. Today's parable from the 20th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew calls us to look to Jesus once again and to grapple with an offense to our sense of what is fair. At least that is one way that this particular parable can be heard, as not being very fair. We might call it the parable of the unfair boss. But when you hear that title, the parable of the unfair boss, you got to stop yourself and ask, does that really sound like the title of a story that Jesus would tell? No. What would Jesus call this story? The parable of the boss who left no one behind? The parable of a boss whose heart was as big as his bank account? The parable of the boss who was surprisingly generous? How about the parable of the boss who invested in the future with abundant mercy and grace? Remember, Jesus prefaces this story that he tells by saying the kingdom of heaven is like. Jesus is shining a light on what the kingdom of heaven is like when he tells this story. As much as this may challenge our deeply held assumptions about what is, quote, fair, in other words, those who work more ought to be paid more, etc., this story is not unfair. The boss, or the owner, is very upfront with those that he hires at the beginning of the day, that they will be paid a day's wages. And then he tells all the subsequent workers, I will pay you whatever is fair. The kingdom of heaven, then, in this story, looks like everyone being paid a living wage. The kingdom of heaven also has room and grace for those who grumble and don't understand why they won't receive more than the others who came a little later. Jesus shows us that the kingdom of heaven is for those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And if that sounds familiar, that's because that comes from earlier in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, verse 6. The kingdom of heaven is for those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Who are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness? Those who haven't found work and are still sitting around the marketplace at the end of the day because no one will hire them. The homeless, the old, the injured, ex-convicts, the sick, the mentally ill. Jesus says, you will be filled. The generosity of the landowner challenges our notions of what is just and shows us what God's justice looks like. And God knows that it is not a crime to be poor. It's not a crime to be sick, or old, or mentally challenged, or ill. In God's vineyard, in the kingdom of heaven, there is overflowing and abundant grace. And we don't have to do anything to deserve this abundant grace of God. Not only do we not have to do anything, we cannot do anything to deserve this abundant grace of God. Grace is a freely given gift of our Creator. And we are God's kids. And like all parents, God wants to give us good things. God wants to love us. Now we have to ask ourselves as well, does Jesus tell us stories like this one for today simply so that we will be assured of God's mercy for our own sakes? And the answer to that question, of course, is no. Jesus is always the teacher, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. And this goes all the way back to the first time he sat down on that hill in Galilee in what we now call the Sermon on the Mount, which begins at the beginning of chapter 5. In Matthew, Jesus is teaching us what the kingdom of heaven is like so that we might do God's will on earth and live the kingdom of heaven today. We are to live lives of abundant grace and mercy in the church and as apostles sent into the world. Jesus also said in the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy." All of this circles back to that question I asked last week, and I mentioned again at the beginning of my sermon, that question of where we want to invest our energy and our time. If we keep our eyes on Jesus and practice forgiveness, and practice mercy, practice abundant love, then we live in a hope for a future and a realization of the kingdom of heaven right now. However, we have other choices. And if we choose to look only to our own sense of justice and demand satisfaction for all that offends us, well, then we're investing our energy into building a resentment. And boy, we will work tirelessly to maintain that resentment. My friends, the choice is yours. And I encourage you to choose grace, to choose mercy, to choose love. And I invite you to decide not to make that choice of grace and mercy and love to be conditional on anyone else's response. Keep your eyes on Jesus, for he is the source and the teacher of grace and mercy and love. And we, you and I, we are merely the vessels. We're just the conduits for all that to flow through, and that is as it should be.